Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. I am Beth Mashesky, Senior Scientific Specialist at the Illinois Sustainable Technology Center, which is part of the Prairie Research Institute at the University of Illinois. A few housekeeping items before we get started. I'd like to remind our audience members here to please silence electronic devices as we are recording today's webinar. We will be holding all questions until the end. At that time, for those here in our audience, I'll bring around the microphone so that everyone online can hear your question. For everyone online, you'll be muted for the entire webinar, but you can type in your questions at any time through the GoToWebinar toolbar, and I'll be reading those to the speaker at the end. And with that, I'm very pleased to welcome today's speaker, Angela Foster-Rice. Angela is an environmental attorney and sustainability leader with over 20 years of experience developing global corporate strategies to reduce environmental risks. She founded Ariel Consulting in 2018, which provides support for companies and organizations on sustainability, climate policy, and strategies for mitigation and resiliency. Prior to that, she was with United Airlines for 15 years, first as Environmental Health and Safety Counsel, and then leading environmental affairs and sustainability. She also played a key role in the airline delegation to the United Nations, which helped create the first global carbon emissions regulation for any industry. I'll also note that Angela is an advisory board member for the Illinois Sustainable Technology Center. So Angela, thank you for joining us, and the webinar is yours.
Thanks so much, Beth. Thanks for the opportunity to speak with all of you today. And it's a topic that's become very near and dear to my heart. We might kind of wonder why, coming from the airline industry, but as I was engaged in thinking about carbon reductions, we were looking at all the levers we could do from a technology perspective, but it's constrained in terms of what can be done to reduce emissions in the near term. And so carbon offsetting and potential insetting can provide another lever, and also help think about what are the broader corporate social responsibility goals in the communities that we serve. So that's what really got me excited about the space, and I've continued to engage more in my own consulting firm, Ariel Consulting. So with that, we'll get started with, I've heard of carbon offsetting, but what is carbon insetting and how can it reduce the carbon footprint of my supply chain? So on regard to carbon offsetting and insetting, here's kind of the short answer. And that is, carbon offsetting, people are familiar with. You purchase a carbon emission reduction and you use it to offset your carbon emissions. And so a typical example of that is you have emissions from air travel, and you use offsets that's, for example, from protecting forests from deforestation, and that offsets the carbon from your emissions from travel. So what is carbon insetting? That's when a reduction occurs within the scope of influence of a company, and that's typically in supply chain. We think about this as really from the perspective of a business rather than an individual. An example of that is working with a supplier of a raw material and working with them to reduce their carbon footprint, which in turn reduces your overall footprint from your broader sphere of influence. So that's the short answer. And so if you're real busy and need to head off, that's kind of the punchline. But it's more complicated than that. And I think there's a broader message around why are companies looking at insetting. And that's why, moving on to the next slide, talking a little bit about what's the broader context of trends in businesses and why they would be looking at offsets and insetting being a newer space. So, we have a growing group of stakeholders that are interested in businesses and also government institutions, and what are they doing to address their environmental footprint and also broader social benefits or impacts. Those are shareholders, they're customers / influencers. I use the word influencers as well, because oftentimes you'll see people in social media that may or may not be a customer, or their influence becomes bigger than just their customer power, but actually influence customers through the things they say in social media. You have your business partners, which may or may not be your buyers, but they could be someone you're partnering with in a business transaction, and they care about who they work with. You have your employees that are more focused in the space of working with employers that they believe in. You have the broader community, as we've seen in the climate strike, and of course you have government. So what are some of the things that they're looking at? Well, one is a growing transparency demand. And we are seeing the response by companies that they are significantly increasing their disclosures. We look at the Carbon Disclosure Project, which is not a requirement, but an opportunity for businesses to disclose not only their carbon footprint, but what they're doing about it and how they're preparing for future responses to climate change. And the engagement there has grown 7 times over since 2006. And you now have over 7,000 companies that participate in the Carbon Disclosure Project. And those requirements are getting deeper in terms of what they need to disclose. We now have the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which is really looking more deeply as to what should be the standards be for what should be disclosed. You have science-based targets for carbon emissions, and there have been 500 companies committed as of March, and this really goes beyond setting targets for your scope 1 and scope 2. This goes to scope 3, your supply chain. And if you're not terribly familiar, you're scratching your head to remember what are those different scopes, I do have a slide and a couple slides later that will remind everyone about what falls in the scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. But scope 3 is an area where you hit your supply chain. So now, looking at setting carbon emission target reductions, that includes your supply chain, and that gets very tricky. Expectation growing of companies to be purpose-driven, not just thinking about their profits. We saw just maybe about a month ago that there were nearly 200 CEOs that signed the Statement of Corporate Purposes, and these were kind of the largest companies out there, and essentially stating that their purpose is broader than profits and are looking, at the broader impact of the business and communities and those social benefits beyond profit. You have 88% of consumers looking for brands to support their environmental and ethical priorities. Doesn't mean they're always doing it. They may not have the information available, but they're looking, they're thinking about how the brands will support their own social environmental priorities. And then another slide on these pressures, they just keep building. You have the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and with that is this UN tracker where companies and institutions and governments are asked to make commitments to help meet those goals, and then those are tracked. And there's 5,000 commitments thus far in the UN tracker. There's a broader view of sphere of responsibility. What am I responsible for as a company or institution? Looking at upstream, downstream, not just at your direct impacts. And the last thing I'll mention is around specifically investors in this area of environmental social governance and thinking about how they're investing. They're seeking disclosures, including institutional investors, from who they want to invest in or have invested in, to say, what are you doing from an environmental perspective? How are you addressing the social and governance factors as well? And in fact, the signing on the principles for responsible investment has grown exponentially. There's a total of 2,300 institutions and companies that have signed, but 500 of those have been signed up in the last year. And that impact investing space has grown to 1 in every $4 in professionally managed accounts. So, why I mention this is thinking about that scope of influence and that scope of expectations. Now it's growing, and companies are struggling with how do I think that through and how do I manage it? And here's a diagram to remind you of scope 1 is your specific company, like your industrial facilities, your buildings, your vehicles. Scope 2 are those indirect emissions from the energy that you utilize And then scope 3 is both upstream and downstream activities. It can be from the goods that you purchase and services. It can be from your waste, from your travel. Downstream, it can be the use of your products and the transportation distribution. So, this is a pretty big scope of influence in thinking about what are expectations around companies as they think about reductions from emissions. I'm also going to mention one other piece of this puzzle, and this will all make more sense as we work our way through the presentation. But this is around nature-based solutions for climate mitigation. And this is a particularly important when you think about insetting and your own supply chain. So in August of 2019, there was an IPCC report that came out that found that carbon sequestration, and that's in soil, like in the way you do farming practices, for example, that can increase the soil and the carbon or decrease it, or the sequestration in vegetation, such as in forests, that is a mitigation solution with the most potential for removing carbon from the atmosphere at a lower cost and could deliver a whole bunch of other co-benefits. So it's being looked at as a really important piece of the puzzle. Land degradation is 23% of man-made carbon emissions, 23%. I'll compare that with, say, for example, aviation, which is 2% of man-made carbon emissions. So just some comparison there as we think this through. And that includes deforestation and forest degradation, is about half of the land sector, about 23%. Protecting and restoring the land has a potential to contribute over 1/3 of the total climate change mitigation that scientists indicate are needed to meet the Paris Agreement. So it's pretty significant. And you have all these co-benefits, the soil health, the water quality, biodiversity, and supporting those people that rely upon those areas for their livelihoods. So we think about these projects that are land-based, it's forests, it's agriculture, it's ranching, wetlands, and a term called blue carbon, which is thinking about the carbon in our oceans. And example for that is mangroves that can take in and sequester carbon. And the uptake on nature-based solutions has been more limited compared to, for example, uptake on energy efficiency or renewables. And if you think about it, nature-based solutions are not a space that has had any regulation. There hasn't been state mandates to increase. There's not utilities that potentially can generate fees from customers and then use that to offer programs, as we're seeing in different states. So you just really don't have as much of a clear economic benefit, although the economic benefit exists. It's just not as clear and as well understood. So you're just not seeing the same uptake. And that's why financing through carbon offsets or insets are considered to be an important source of funding. And there's studies showing how companies are changing the way they're looking at carbon offsets and what they're thinking about for their broader purpose goals. And on that, I'll get into more on that in the next slide. And briefly here, the trends on carbon offsetting. And there's not the same studies on insetting, because insetting is a newer thing. But a 2019 study by Ecosystem Marketplace found that, first of all, the vast majority of voluntary market offset purchases are following these structured standards and procedures that meet these defined obligations. And if project developers meet them, then the offset standard or program will issue offsets, requiring third-party validation and verification, and meeting these requirements that they're real, additional, measurable, and verifiable. And from January to March of 2018, 25% of offsets purchased in the voluntary market was forestry and land use. So you're seeing a growing interest, although still a lot of interest in other areas too. And that's that depiction on the right of the slide shows you, what was purchased in that first quarter of 2018. There's also a growing buyer purpose around broader sustainability strategy, how companies are thinking about what am I buying in terms of the offset? How does it meet my broader corporate social responsibility goals? And there's a greater willingness to pay higher prices for it. Okay, all that was kind of an intro to, okay, why insetting? How is this coming about? Why is it coming about? And there's an organization that really has propelled the development of insetting, and that's the International Platform for Insetting, called IPI. It's a multi-stakeholder platform. It was launched in 2015, and it was to facilitate insetting practices for the business world by defining, more clearly what is insetting, because it could mean a lot of different things, promoting those best practices, and creating a way to certify projects under an insetting standard, and actually registering them in a blockchain registry. So that blockchain registry is currently in development. And I put it here over to the right who has participated as members and partners. So you can see who the project developers are, such as South Pole, Ecosphere, which are very commonly in the space. In the offsetting space, are now also engaging in insetting. You see insetting companies. Some of these are big names like L'Oreal and Espresso and others. They have been engaged in making this happen. You see the certification bodies, and also, although not listed here, BCS Vera is also engaged, and they came on a little bit later. You have a number of the supporting partners like WWF. So the fundamental principle here for why IPA started to engage here was to identify the interdependencies of supply chains, with their ecosystem. So essentially, a company has a supply chain, it's impacting a broader ecosystem, and then enabling businesses to develop a holistic approach to climate action that's considering their impacts, and able to then see those impacts and then reduce those impacts. If you look at, as you talk about the science-based targets, there's also a real need to think about, well, how can I reduce my Scope 3 emissions? So insetting can help companies understand ways to reduce their Scope 3 emission targets, and obviously contribute to sustainable development goals. So here's an example, and L'Oreal has really been considered a leader and trailblazer in the space of insetting. They developed a carbon strategy which first looks at reducing their direct industrial emissions, and also looking at their downstream logistics. So, as we think about the different scopes, it's looking at their Scope 1, and then they also focused on their Scope 2, and also really focused on part of their Scope 3 reductions, which was the downstream logistics. And they have that's reduced by 77% compared to 2005 levels, which is really terrific. And then they thought about, well, what can I do to further reduce my impacts? Where can I find kind of the biggest bang for my buck, given that technologies continually evolve to reduce their direct impacts and other scope impacts. So they partnered with raw material suppliers to obtain reductions through carbon insetting, with a goal of what they called carbon balance. And what they meant by this was they want to have reductions in their suppliers' carbon emission reductions that will completely offset or equalize their emissions from their industrial facilities and from all their downstream emissions. So it's kind of the concept of insetting has kind of evolved over time, but that was their initial goals around doing this. And they partnered with a supplier to provide 1,500 improved stoves. This has to do with the production of shea butter, which is used in a lot of the L'Oreal makeup products, lipsticks, etc. And so it was to provide these new stoves to replace the ones that are used. The current ones are called these 3-stone stoves, and they have a lot more emissions, and that's also it's that there commonly are the women in those communities that are doing this work, and the harvesting of this butter is called the white gold, and they're out there harvesting, and then they're scalding these nuts in order to boiling them in order to prepare them, and that creates a lot of emissions. So by replacing these stoves and also preventing the cutting down of nearly 800 tons of timber that was used for these stoves, so that's resulted in prevention emission reduction of almost 60,000 tons of CO2, and also generated savings and improved health. So an example of really thinking about the broader ecosystem of the supply chain and what could L'Oreal do to support those women that were part of that supply chain while also reducing their broader carbon emissions. Another example is the Noble Institute, and this is an organization within the U.S. And they have partnered in what's called the Ecosystem Services Marketplace Consortium. And this is part of a growing carbon insetting, offsetting marketplace for U.S. farms and ranches. Not that it has to be exclusively to the U.S., but there's like a growing interest within the U.S. to develop these methodologies and platforms. And it's in order to accelerate carbon financing for regenerative farming and ranching, and to find a way to do that that's less costly to implement in order to increase the benefits and encourage participation by farmers and ranchers. And just a little bit more about really what this is. An example is for farms, this may be laying down biochar over a farm, which helps to increase the uptake within the soil of carbon in the atmosphere. So you're sequestering sequestering carbon into the soil, and that is considered to potentially be really game changing from the perspective of carbon mitigation. But how do we get farmers to do that? So this is a partnership of well-known businesses and organizations around food. You have companies like ADM and Bunge and Cargill and General Mills and Tyson Foods, Mars, McDonald's, Bayer. I mean, these are big companies that are trying to think through how to best encourage these regenerative farming practices, and are also thinking more broadly about the sphere of their carbon emissions and other impacts. You also have the Nature Conservancy involved, and the National Farmers Union, and I won't read them all there. You can see all the players that are involved. So this is a significant group of parties that have engaged. They're piloting projects right now, and they are both in the agriculture and the ranching space to see how their protocols work and practice on their platform. And they intend to release and go public mid next year. And they're creating protocols both for carbon insetting, which they call this tier 1, and also for generating carbon offset credits that would meet scope 3. The tier 1 carbon insetting can help meet your scope 3 reporting. Going back again to what IPI was talking about, which was carbon insetting can be used to demonstrate that you're meeting your scope 3 science-based targets for reductions in your supply chain. So that's one piece of the puzzle in what they're developing. But they're also developing a protocol for carbon offsetting as well, what they call their tier 2. So anyway, and I included a chart that they've used, which really shows that they're looking to increase the rigor of monitoring, reporting, and verification, depending upon whether or not you're doing insetting and offsetting. And the reason for that is in the insetting space, the view is that you're working very closely with individuals that are in your supply chain that you know, and that you can monitor more effectively. And the idea also is to increase uptake of these practices and really motivate them in a way that's cost effective. As you start to separate from the actual source of the offset, or of the carbon mitigation, I should say, then that's where they view the greater rigor in monitoring, reporting, and verification, and also the costs go up. So they're creating two different ways to think about it. And I'll say that this is a little bit different, I would say, than what the IPI, the International Insetting Organization, is looking at it, and that their IPI is, I would say, taking an approach that's much more similar to traditional offsetting and coming up with the methodologies and protocols. So Noble Institute's looking for ways to bifurcate and create reduced requirements for insetting. And they're not the only ones in this space. An example of a couple others here. Indigo Ag is one. Another is the soil value exchange, which I have to mention because they're near and dear to my heart. I've been consulting with them over the last year and really excited to see where they go. So I thrown in here an example of a carbon offset project, just as a kind of comparison point. Well, insetting sounds really terrific. What can you do with offsetting? Like what's kind of the differences? Well, offsetting also can provide this broad benefits. I mean, not only this AutoMile project in Peru, which is created by Conservation International, it's really an amazing carbon offset project. It's bringing, it's twice the size of New York City. This project is protecting from deforestation. It's reduced that deforestation rate by 75%, and it's provided all these benefits to 240,000 people plus, providing communities with financial, social, and environmental benefits. And the idea here is to help these individuals that depend on these forests to their livelihoods, to not be persuaded to deforest them for farming purposes, that actually the forest can give them great social and environmental benefits, and they are receiving economic benefits and training, et cetera, by the project. They have already had over 6.2 million tons of CO2 reduction. So this is an incredible project. And you have companies like Disney and United Airlines and others that are supporters of this, Disney being the largest. And Disney has treated this both as an offset project, and they also have purchased products, the coffee, from the AutoMile project. So kind of, you can see that crossover between offsetting and insetting. So here's an example. Like, okay, so we're talked about insetting and offsetting. I'm just, well, what is the difference? What might I think about as a business if I want to do offsetting and insetting? And I'm thinking about partnering with a supplier. So I'll give the example: a coffee producer wants to partner with a supplier on carbon reduction. So what are the differences? A lot of them are similar, as you see across. You can partner with a supplier, you can align the project with the company's corporate social responsibility and sustainability goals. You can align it with your Scope 3 science-based target goal. You can measure the carbon reductions and other benefits such as biodiversity and soil quality. You could validate that through accepted protocols. The difference is, one of the differences is, in the offset side, you're purchasing the carbon offsets at the end of it, and then you can use that to report your reductions in your Scope 3 emissions if you want to. In carbon insetting, you're documenting the carbon insetting. So you're not purchasing offsets, you're documenting what those reductions were, and you're validating, like I said, through these protocols and measurement procedures. And then you're reporting the reductions in your Scope 3 emissions. So that's really, from a mechanics perspective, the big difference. One is this monetary instrument that's formally being purchased through an offset, and the carbon insetting can be the documentation that, yes, these reductions have occurred and they've been documented, and that the product buyer can then say, okay, I can then feel comfortable making those statements in my CSR report, or in the potential brand products that they then in turn sell to consumers as sustainable or meeting lower carbon goals. So essentially, under either strategies, you can align your CSR carbon reduction goals, but the difference being that the structures for carbon insetting have been specifically evolved to look directly at addressing carbon reductions within a supply chain and your broader sphere of influence. So you can do it in both spaces. It's just that carbon insetting is being, the reason it has evolved and been created is specifically around the space of looking at reductions in your broader sphere of influence. So, again, like kind of as a summary of this, what are these considerations? I'm thinking about engaging in carbon insetting. What should I look at? Well, what's the purpose for engaging? If you're seeking to develop a tailored project with a supplier, seeking to reduce carbon specifically within your supply chain. So, this will, doing an insetting project requires greater resources financially and the time to put forth. So if you're a business, say going back to that, I'm a company that produces coffee, and I want the coffee bean growers I want to have an inset project with them. Then you're doing outreach. You can work with companies like South Pole and offset developers to create that offset, but it's that time and engagement to make it happen, to come up with what it consists of and what your expectations are and that relationship. The resources, I'm thinking about resources, the money needs to be significant enough that your supplier will take those steps. I mean, you can find ways to sort of put the pressure on a supplier to say, I want this, but if these are from developing countries or other places where they just don't have the financial ability, or the farming community, which is already has low profit margins, and it's really being able to come up with enough financial benefit for these entities to then move forward with doing the inset. The money paid to offer offsets typically is higher, and the reason being that they're tradable. There's a larger group of buyers that can purchase them. They can be used in certain compliance markets. So you can see here, there's some of those trade-offs, financially. And there's carbon insets have the potential to have less transaction costs. That goes back to what the Noble Institute's doing with ECMS, with their ecosystems marketplace. They're looking for ways to reduce those transaction costs for insetting. So with any strategy, you can decide if you'd like to pursue your broader goals and just some these different considerations. With that, really concludes my prepared remarks, and I'd be happy to take any questions. Back to you, Beth.
Yep, wonderful presentation. So much information to digest. I'll remind our online audience that you can type in your questions at any time during the question session, and I will read those to Angela. While they're kind of mulling over what they want to ask, I'll get the ball rolling with a question. I guess I was thinking, like, in your opinion, what industries do you see not doing carbon insetting and could either highly benefit from it or could easily implement carbon insetting strategies?
Are you saying that what companies aren't doing that could do it, essentially?
Yeah, essentially.
Yes. So I think that the food space is a big one. I mean, we're starting to see it with the Noble Institute, but the food space is enormous. And there's such a focus now on, reductions of carbon from the food sector, and it's obviously very consumer-facing industry. So with those burdens that are increasing expectations, working with the suppliers, whether that's ranching, in regard to meat, or it's looking at agriculture, corn or what have you, to reduce those impacts. And that, to me, is a ripe space for continued expansion. Not the only one, but one that is ripe for expansion. Any other questions?
Yep, we just got one in. Susan asks, what types of jobs are available in this area, and what educational background do you recommend for students interested in this area?
Oh, that's a great one. This is really an expansive space, because you have people that are in the finance space that are looking to finance offset projects and kind of create the space, create the platform. So so you could be you know, somebody who's sort of in the investment space and is looking to bring and create funds that will support the space. You could be in the, you know, understanding the technical pieces. We see so much more work around particularly with the land-based, you know, soil studying the benefits, you know, what methodologies in farming and in ranching and in forestry, what will increase soil carbon and the uptake in vegetation more quickly. So as we engage in this space, we know a lot about it, but there's so much more to learn. You know, for example, you know, the University of Illinois has been involved in doing different setting around biochar, and in fact, I think, Beth, you've done some research in that space too, but there's more to be done in these different technical methodologies to increase the uptake. There also is the auditing space, which, you know, people who are interested in kind of being part of that whole puzzle of how do you evaluate the practices that are being done, and that can be people from all different professions. You need people that are you know, good at marketing and can get out there and tell the story, are good in communications. You also people that are engaged around policy. That these standards that are being developed are essentially a quasi-governmental role, because they become, they're voluntary standards, but they then really dictate what are the rules, how do you prove up that you're meeting these emission reductions. So they're really, that could be, you know, in the legal space or the government, you know, government policy space. So, so I guess the answer is you could probably come from pretty much any background and find a piece of this that you can apply your background to.
BK asks, what proportion of companies are going for insetting versus offsetting?
I don't know the specific, but it's small. I mean, this is really a very new space. You know, it really didn't formally get sprung until about 2016, so 2015. So it's not that it hasn't been out there. I mean, companies have been doing it without calling it insetting, like just by its nature, thinking about their supply chain. But it's, don't have a percentage, but very, very small. How's that?
And BK also asks, could you provide some examples of companies going for inset program and why?
Yes, so so Nespresso is a company that has in the coffee space, and so they have engaged in looking at their supply chain and thinking about it from you know, the pressures to demonstrate their reductions of scope 3 emissions, but also the pressures to ensure that they're thinking about sustainable development. So from the, you know, coffee, I guess I've already talked about coffee. Coffee is a natural example. Others are in the food space. In addition, there are companies that have been looking at how can we prevent deforestation in our supply chain, and have looked at how to reduce those impacts. So there are, you know what I can do, BK, and for others is I can provide some additional examples after this presentation, kind of a couple links to what are some of the various companies in the space. Chanel is one. Actually, Chanel has been a terrific, and of course they're thinking about the water impacts and you know, the products that they need to develop, the raw materials they need to develop their products. So it's a combination of the pressures from a broader view of what are your carbon emission impacts, and also a desire to support the Sustainable Development Goals and ensure that your supply chain is sustainable.
BK says, that'll be great. Thanks for an excellent presentation. If you want, I was thinking that you could add an extra slide at the end of your presentation and then email me, and then I can just post it and let everyone know who's on the call
Absolutely.
when it's posted. So, yeah.
I'd be happy to do that. Be great.
Okay. Heather asks, are there ways for individuals to participate in and support carbon insetting comparable to how people can choose to buy carbon offsets on their own initiative?
Heather, that's a great question. I haven't seen that yet. I think it might, you know, if a company offers, I think there is one company that does this, I'm not remembering who it is, that has created, essentially, they've created an offset within their supply chain. So it's really more of an offset, but it's within their supply chain. So they have partnered and within the supply chain created an offset and then are offering that to buyers of their product. So there are just different ways to go about it and thinking about how companies are partnering with their supply chain. So that's where I've seen it, but I haven't seen it in other spaces as of yet.
And Frederick asks, between insetting and offsetting, which one would you recommend to companies?
So it really, I don't have a preference over one over the other. I think it really depends on the specific goals of the company. You know, like for example, you know, I think about, you know, United Airlines, and when I was there, I mean, we were partnering with Conservation International and the AutoMile Project, and there it was, you know, that was a country we flew to, I'm not, you know, not anymore, they still fly there, and the ability and the desire to help around the SDG goals, Sustainable Development Goals. So, you know, there's not a insetting there per se, unless you look at insetting from a broader perspective than has been structured thus far, you know, with IPI and others. But there is a kind of broader view of, you know, how can I look at how my corporate social responsibility goals can be supported by offsetting or insetting. So it just depends upon how you want to make that connection. If you want to make it, if you're a company that is particularly utilizes land-based raw materials, you know, agriculture, or you're in a business that is your supply chain is potentially causing deforestation, there can be a more pointed view of looking at insetting as a way to demonstrate what you're doing in your broader sphere of influence and how important it is to demonstrate your supply chain is sustainable. So it depends upon the specific pressures and goals that a company has.
We haven't had any more questions come in from online, and we don't have any more in the room. If there aren't any more by the time I'm done saying the next thing, then we'll probably conclude. I'll just mention that I'll probably post the recording of today's webinar within the next couple of weeks. And then once Angela sends her slides to me, I'll get those posted and send out that email to give you guys access to the recording and the slides.
Well, thank you, Beth, for the opportunity. Thank you to everyone for participating, and just you know, really been terrific to have this opportunity with the Illinois Sustainable Technology Center. And I hope that folks will tune in to some of the other presentations as well.
Wonderful. What other last thoughts do you want to leave with us for carbon insetting?
You know, I'll just say that you know, this thinking about how offsets and insets can partner with a broader carbon strategy. You know, I think that's one point in history. There was these structures were not as sophisticated, and people worried, is it really happening? Is it permanent? Is it additional? And there's been such growth in this space, and I would encourage companies and organizations to really think about it as an important piece of the puzzle while you reduce your emissions. You know, what can be done to support carbon mitigation in the land sector. So I just want to encourage people to think about that as a real lever in climate mitigation.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you.